I'm really excited to be talking about you don't need JavaScript for that, because obviously we're talking a lot about JavaScript today, but there's a lot of things that people use it for that it just isn't needed. But of course, I have a YouTube channel that's devoted to CSS. So of course, I'm the person who's going to say, you don't need JavaScript for that. I might have a little bit of a bias in terms of CSS solutions when possible, or even just HTML solutions when possible. But I do think that it's really important that we don't avoid JavaScript for the sake of avoiding it. And this is something that I'll talk a bit more about later on. There's a purpose to JavaScript. There's a reason we have it. There's a reason it's such a big part of the web. But we don't want to reinvent the wheel a little bit. We were talking about installing, node packages when you could just write a small script to do it. Even better than that is when there's functionality that exists where you don't even have to do anything that works, that's really good. And yeah, so when we can do that, it's usually a good thing. And today I want to cover a lot of things that do this, will help you not reinvent the wheel, that I see people doing a lot. There's a lot of modern CSS coming along that we'll touch on at the very end, but most of the things I'm going to be talking about today are actually like super old and just people aren't aware of them. And then we'll see some of the newer things that are coming if I have time at the end. But yeah, this happens all the time where people do reinvent the wheel. And this obviously means there's more work for the developer, which sucks. You don't want to be doing more work than you have to. More JavaScript potentially means slower sites, which sucks. And it can also have very big negative impact on the user experience as well. And this is a really big one where if you're trying to recreate something, often there's a lot of accessibility things that are baked into the native features that are really hard to actually recreate properly. And so you might not realize it at the time. And I'm not just talking about the slower sites here, but just significant accessibility things. And we'll see some examples of that as we go through this too. The first one I do like to talk about is smooth scrolling because it's a really simple one. It's actually one that a lot of people do know that we have with CSS, but also that there's a reason people avoid it. And I want to talk, show how we can actually fix that as well with just an extra line of CSS. Before I look at the example here, we're going to be doing a lot of code examples. I'm going to be diving into it. I'm talking a little bit fast. I do apologize. And I'm going to be going kind of quick through the examples. I more want to be showing you what's possible so you can just remember that and go and look into it. And all of the links to these code pens are available. I have a link on the last slide, and the people at JetBrains have it too, and we'll share it with you. So if you want to see any of the examples, you can. With smooth scrolling, really important, if you are going to do things that involve a lot of motion, you probably want to put it in a prefers reduced motion media query, just so people that have vestibular issues don't have any problems when they got on your site. Because if somebody does have vestibular issues, they can get a headache, they can get migraines, they can have nausea and other things if all of a sudden the site's scrolling or you have big motion going on. So just want to say that really quickly, and it's super easy just to wrap it in that media query. So here's the first example we'll look at where I just have an exaggerated height navigation here, where I can use anchor links that I have set up that just go to a different ID on my page. And this is always kind of a weird experience because it's hard to know when you've actually got anywhere. So we can turn on that prefers reduced motion media query right here. So it's the exact same one that we just had the screenshot of. And now it will scroll, and that's it. There's no work to be done. There's nothing else. It just works. And I've seen this recreated with JavaScript a lot of times. So if you have, you can refactor some of your code now. But there's obviously another big problem that comes up when you do this is if I go to the top, I don't see the top because it's hiding underneath this navigation bar. Or if I go to middle, it scrolls too far. And this is usually where people go, well, this doesn't really work for me. I have to use some JavaScript. But you don't. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to do an HTML. And I'm going to do scroll padding. And I'm going to say 10 rem. It's a bit magic numbery, but it's going to work because I have this giant one. And you can see now, because my navigation just happens to be a bit less than 10 rem in height. So now it's creating a padding on where I'm scrolling to, and it just stops where I want it to. I did include this outside of the media query here, because let's say somebody has prefers reduced motion enabled on their system. That just means that now when it jumps to, let the code pen refresh. When it jumps to this area, that padding still applies, even though we're not smooth scrolling, but you don't lose the text underneath. So that makes life a lot easier. There is scroll padding and scroll margin. Like with padding or margin, try one. If it's not the right one, try the other one. In this case, it would be scroll padding that I want to use. The other choice is you can do your target. So target, and then I would actually want to do scroll margin. So margin goes on the element itself, padding goes on the thing that's scrolling. It's not easy to remember which one you want, but now I've actually recreated the same experience. And target is literally, if I click on top, it's the target is the thing with an ID of top on it. The reason I put this here is because you might want to do something like this, just to add, and this is way exaggerated, but I just wanted to show that it's possible, where we can do an animation of target, and I'll just say it's 1 second, which is probably a bit too long. But when we scroll to that area, I can highlight where I've scrolled to, which can help with the user experience a little bit. You probably don't want it in a bright red like that. It's really ugly. But you can do that. You could even say something like target H2, or maybe we want to be a bit more specific, the direct child or H2 first child, whatever we need. You can set that up how you need. But then the animation, I broke it because it's probably not an H2. I thought it was. I thought that I broke something along the way. Oh, I put the scroll margin here now. That's why. Okay, I'll take that off. But you could have it set up so, is that fixed? Yeah, you could have it so the animation is running on the H2 instead. Actually, we could do a bit of CSS nesting now, and I could actually get that to work, I believe. There we go. So you see we're highlighting the thing itself. Again, you might not want to necessarily do that. Target's really powerful and something that a lot of people don't realize that we have. So I just wanted to throw that in there as a little bonus fact. Another place where people do not take advantage of the CSS that we have available is with forms. I am saying CSS is a great first line of defense, and we'll talk more about that. You don't want to use this for real form validation. I'm never going to say use CSS for form validation, but you can do it as a form of validation for the user before they've put anything in. And just for this, getting through this one quickly, I have set things up already. But this one, I just have some colors set up in my custom properties. So if I come into my input here and I start writing, you're going to see it's in green. So I'm getting an outline that's in green. And the way I'm doing this is if we have a focus and it's valid, and all we have right now is an input type of text and it's required. So for a type of text to be valid, it just needs some text in there. And then it's getting the valid on there. I do have this extra thing on here. Actually, we don't really need that first one, but this one here is saying it's valid and the placeholder isn't currently being shown. So that just means if we're in the box and we haven't done anything yet, the placeholder's there. So we're not going to get the success state until both we're valid and the placeholder is no longer shown. And we can just let the user know that it was good. This isn't the best use case for it, in my opinion, but we can do a little bit more to help users out, because I'm sure you've been on a form, filled the whole thing out, hit submit, then it does the server-side validation and then returns an error. And that's really frustrating when you have 4 fields that you have to go and revisit. It'd be really nice if you could have immediate feedback. So here, if I start writing an email address, it's showing up in yellow because it's not valid yet. And once I get to a valid email address, then it goes away. But if I don't enter a valid email address, I'm getting it in red with a little warning coming up underneath just saying, please enter a valid email. This is just being done with an input type of email, once again, that's required. And then I also have a little div underneath it for the please enter the text here is just in a div that's coming underneath that has a display none on it. And we can come down far enough. I have this saying that if our input is not being focused, so it's only when I leave the input and there's no placeholder shown, so I know the user's already written something in there, the error that's following that input will get, we're changing it to a display block so it becomes visible. You might want to do some testing with this just for screen readers and other things to make sure this text is being read out loud if you think it's important enough for that. But it's a nice extra thing because only having color isn't enough. And even just the switch here from green to yellow probably isn't enough because a lot of people do suffer from color blindness, and just relying on color for hinting and helping users know state is never going to be enough. So having some text or other things that can go along with it can go a really long way. And then we can do even more. So my password down here is really cool because here I have my input type of password. So it's going to be a password field, enter a minimum of 12 characters, but I have a minimum length on there. So this isn't going to be considered valid until there's 12 characters in there. And that's just a nice thing that is there. It means the user can't submit this form even, because let's say I do at hi@email.com and I try and submit this, like the form can't be submitted here because it knows that we need 12 on there. So this is a minimum length. You can do a minimum length, whatever you want to set things for your inputs. It doesn't just have to be for passwords, but that's probably the one place where you might want to actually use it. And I'm doing the same thing here for the hinting because it makes sense. You get a hint as you're typing it to remind you what the minimum requirement is. And then once we pass it and we get to where we need, the hint can actually go away because we hit the valid state. And I'm doing the same thing I did before. The same thing I did before here, just for both my hint and my error to show up or disappear. One of them is if the placeholders, sorry, this one is when we're focused and this one is when we're not focused. So it's the hint at the beginning, and then when we leave focus, then we'll show the error. So that one's kind of fun, but one thing that makes it even better is you can actually, if you're using regex for your server-side form validation, you can use that same regex as a pattern on your input type. So here on my input type password, if you're making sure that there's a certain number of characters and not everything else, I'll just put it at the beginning here. But we can put a pattern there, and this means that I need letters and numbers. That's probably not the best one, but it's something. So I can put as many characters here as I want. It's never actually considered valid at this point because the browser knows that unless I'm meeting this pattern, it's not going to work. And then as soon as I put one number in there, it becomes valid. Or if I put a whole bunch of numbers, it's not valid until I have one regular character. So you can use the same pattern on the client side or just within your HTML that you're using on server side, or something simplified here, but at least to give the user that first hint before they hit that submit button, because I find that's really useful to do. And on the email, you might have noticed that as soon as I have this, it's considered valid. And I think even this is considered valid. Oh no, that one's not, which is kind of weird. You can also use a pattern on your input type email just to make sure there is like a dot and then at least 2 letters coming after it if you wanted to. So you can set that up on your email. And there's actually a lot more you can do with inputs. Inputs are great. And there's so many different things we can do with them. So here on this one that we have right there, how many tickets, I just have a minimum and maximum set. And so if I come, and this is an input type of number. There's some weird stuff with input type numbers, but I can hit that up arrow as many times as I want. It will never go past 6. Or if I come in and I put a number, because you can manually type it in, that's larger than what I wanted to, I can use a little bit of CSS to see what's going on there. So I can say if it's not in range, and then it knows that it's not within this min and max right there. So I can change the styling on it. Another really good one, and this is an HTML only. We're gonna have a few HTML only things here. I ignore my typo. If you have an input type of color, you can get a color picker that's better than a color picker that you can create yourself. Because the color picker that comes with the system, first you can change from HSL to hex and all of that. That you probably can't see. I just realized that. But one thing you'll see, you get a color picker coming up on here. I do apologize that you can't see it, but you can play with this demo after. The reason you can't see it is this is actually a system level one, and I'm only sharing my window. But I can there's a eyedropper in there that actually allows you to pick a color that that isn't in your browser window, and that's not something that's available if you create your own color picker within the browser, just for security reasons. But the system level eye picker can pick colors from anywhere. So I can get my browser tab color, for example, or something like that. So just a really quick win with the type color there. And the last one here is with a checkbox. This is potentially something that's coming, which is the switch attribute that would actually turn it into a switch. This is in Safari's technical preview right now, and it's in proposal phase, I believe. So we might be able to turn that on and then get something that looks like a switch that is completely stylable, but it has a default switch to it or toggle look to it like this right now. I'm on a Windows computer right now, so that doesn't work. So I did have to style this myself, but it's also a really easy thing to style. I just have my toggle set, and then I have a pseudo element for my circle, and then I'm just using the check state to control where the color, and then the check state to move the toggle back and forth. So it's not difficult now, but it'd be pretty cool. We're probably going to get, or we will be getting something because they're working on it, whether it's an input type checkbox with a switch attribute on it, or whether it ends up becoming its own input type. We're not sure yet, but Safari has this at least in the technical preview, and I'm not sure if they've shipped it beyond that yet. But a couple of quick things there for your forms that you can do. And get out of those. But again, those are first line of defense. Just want to make that really clear. This is all client side. Never do form validation client side only. You'd want to be doing some server side stuff along the way. And along that front, we don't want to go overboard in general. don't want to rely on CSS for our form validation. Uh, we also don't, when you start finding a lot of these pseudo classes and pseudo elements, or especially the pseudo classes that I'm looking at, you start thinking about all the crazy and cool things that you could do. And there's lots of really clever examples of CSS only things that exist out there. But just because you can do it with CSS only doesn't mean you want to do it with CSS only. And I do think that's an important thing to talk about quickly before we move on to other things. So here's an example just of like a really simple tab system that I created, or demo that I created. It's nothing too fancy, but there's a lot of important things in creating tabs that I can't do with CSS. So first of all, when I'm in this, I can click and it looks like I'm clicking and there's nothing fancy. I could recreate this exact functionality with CSS only. But if you're doing tabs properly, you also want to be able to go with your arrow keys. So I'm cycling through just with my left and right arrow right now. If you want to make an accessible tabs, this needs to be one of the features that you include in it. I can't do that with CSS only. There's no way that we could. So that's an important thing. And the other thing is, if I'm on my socials, I should be able to hit my tab and actually come into this area. And it's one of the few times where you actually need to play around with your tab indexes a little bit. Because if a user goes to the marketing and they're using their keyboard, the next thing they should tab to should be that content that has just appeared. And they need to be able to reach that content that they just got to. And in your markup, the order here, you probably have, like if we look at mine, the order here is I have a list, and then I have all my tab actual panels down, lower, down. So just doing all of that with CSS only isn't something you'd be able to do reliably. If you had links in this, it could become a real disaster with tab ordering and other things, depending on how you're doing it. If you're doing a display none, maybe you could get away with it. But it just becomes an extra challenge that CSS only is a fun thing to build, but it's probably not the best idea to rely on CSS for it. Another one is carousels. Lots of examples, really good examples of carousels. I found a code pen and just forked this, and they did a really nice job creating it. CSS only carousel, really neat, with radio buttons and a few other things, but I can't use my keyboard to interact with it at all. And making this so you could interact with it with your keyboard is possible, but it's a ridiculous amount of work that you probably don't want to do, and you'd actually be doing less work if you're using JavaScript. Other things are hamburger menus. There's the checkbox hack that I think a lot of people are aware of, that it was even on Apple's website for the longest time where they were using it. And there's accessibility issues around these types of things where if we're changing the content that's on the screen and we're only using CSS for that to make those changes, often there's not enough information being passed to the browser about what's going on for accessibility reasons. And the way that we're interacting with the elements becomes very limited to how we're interacting with it, which is usually with a mouse clicking around and rarely with keyboard interaction. Some people do a bit of keyboard testing, but we're not going far enough with all of that. So just to be careful with all of that. Now, I did put a star on these two, the carousels and the hamburger menus, and there might be even for tabs, but there are some things in the works right now that could potentially be making these not require JavaScript or require less JavaScript. Hamburger menus especially, we'll see something at the end. I have a demo that we can look at for that. So the important thing is when you're creating something, just think about how the user is interacting with the content. And if the content is changing, that you probably do want some sort of JavaScript there along the way. Whereas if it's just relating to the content that is on the screen, well, then CSS is perfect because CSS knows, generally speaking, what's actually on the page. So as we can see right there, so some examples, we saw that with form elements. CSS is aware of the content on the page. As the user's filling things out, it knows if the thing is valid or invalid, or if it's in range, and all of these other things. We're not changing the content. The user's entering some information, but the page is static, and the CSS is just reacting or styling things according to what it has in front of it. Another thing we can do is select ranges of content, which can be really, really useful. So if you have an image gallery or something like that, this is where I like the example I like giving with it. So a lot of people know we have nth child, but so if I do nth child plus 5, it's actually going to start counting at the 5th child and then count every one, because I'm saying go to the 5th one with the plus 5, and then the n just means every single one after that. What people don't always know is you can actually count backwards as well. So you can use a negative n to count backwards. So if I do a negative nth child negative n, I'm counting starting at the 7th one and then counting all the way back. But you've probably done this where you've combined different pseudo classes together before. I was doing that with my forms before, where I had like a not focus and things like that. So you can combine pseudo classes. So I can actually say that I want to select the 5th to the 7th image nice and easily. And I'll show the code for this one in a second, but you can see now I'm only selecting the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th one. Sorry, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th one, I should say. And you can see that right there. I'm doing nth child that is n plus 5, and it's an nth child that is a negative n plus 7. If you do something like this, please leave a comment in your code, because if a coworker comes across this, they'll have no idea what you did. But a simple comment on here can make it really easy to understand what's happening. And the big advantage of something like this, if you do have a specific layout like I'm doing right now, this could be really, really useful, just because you're not worried about coming on your images and then being like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, this one here needs a class of like span, whatever, right? You're setting up the grid, your gallery, so that it works. Of course, it's going to be specific if it's this number of images and other things, but we're setting up the gallery to work. So you just place your images in there and it's going to do what it needs to do. I don't have time to get into it now, but if you play with this code pen, there's some examples down here on how to actually use the has selector as well. To count how many children are in an element. So it's a combination of has and then the last child with nth child. And right now you can see the background's not red, but just really fast. I have 11. If I remove one of those, the background will change. So, or the border will come on it. So you can actually count how many children something has, then select the children using has, and then so you can actually change the layout depending on how many children are in there as well. So you can combine this technique with this technique and not have to worry about figuring out what children need other classes on it or other things like that. You just plug your content in and your content works. Again, probably want lots of comments in the code just to explain what's happening. But once it's set up, it works and you never really have to worry about it after that. Another really useful thing is detecting other content as well. So if I come and take a look, and we're going to go through a bit quick through these, so I have time at the end to do a few other things. But I just have the same card set up over and over with different content in it. So we have a class of only child, or a pseudo class of only child, where I can select something. So if my card title is the only child within its parent, it gets a larger font size, for example. Or you can do other things, change the padding, change the margins, whatever you need to do on it. You can also see if something is the only one of its type. So it could have siblings, but if it's the only paragraph, so in this case, this card only has one paragraph in it, even though there is a heading as well. So it doesn't matter what other content is there, as long as there's only one paragraph, I change the font size of it. Whereas down here and over here, those font sizes aren't changing. Could be useful in the right situation. Probably not for changing font sizes, but for doing other things. Actually, before another thing, there is a problem with the only of type, is people try and do it with a class and it won't work with a class. So if we take a look here, I have a paragraph of example and then another paragraph underneath it. If I do example only of type, you would assume that it would look for if there's only one class of example, but it doesn't do that. It looks at what example is, and it goes, example is a paragraph. It's not the only one of that type of element, so it's not going to apply it. If I remove that paragraph at the end, then it will change over to red and get bigger. So it is a bit of a annoying thing if you're trying to do this with classes where you can't really do it, and there's not really a good way of doing it. There is an nth of class thing, or with nth of type, they've added a class thing you can do to actually do nth child type behavior, but with classes instead of with elements, that can be useful and potentially could solve this problem, but it's not quite the same thing. Another more practical example of this is here. I could say that if the image is the first child, I could add a border radius to my image, and I'm actually going to make this border radius bigger just to make it more obvious. And so right now the image doesn't have a border radius on it, but I could come down and just move that image up. And now, once it reloads, now it gets the border radius on there. So what could be useful in this case is the border radius is actually a 2rem 0, 0. So we're just getting the border radius across the top. And then it's only if it's the first child. So as soon as that image gets moved or placed somewhere else, it won't have a border radius on it. Or then you could also add this with last child, because some elements know if they're also the last child, and we could do the 0, 0 at the beginning. Whoops. And then you get the same type of behavior if the image is at the end. where it'll get the border radius on the bottom. And once again, this is super useful, not necessarily replacing JavaScript, because you're probably not doing this with JavaScript, but this is just useful for not having to worry about utility classes and placing them, because you might need to match the border radius on the bottom of a card and then on the top of a card and do other stuff, and it's really, really annoying. So these are a bit less replacements for JavaScript than they are just ways to make your life a little bit easier. And then we can also, this one's fun as well. You can use your has selector. As I alluded to before, this is the relational one. So I can say if my card has an only child, we can also do stuff to that card, which is really good. Or you can even choose the element itself at that point. So then I could choose that only child, a bit redundant with this one. But I could choose, if the card has that, then the descendant, which is an only child, will be changed. But you could choose other siblings and other stuff with it along the way as well. It's really powerful. Another one, this one definitely is useful for JavaScript, is if we're using empty, but there are some things you want to watch out for with empty. But here's an example that I like, where I have this weird blue box that's floating there, and it's because it's waiting for to-do lists. So my new list, and it gives me the list. I can create another new list, and then I can open those to-do lists on the side here. But if I have no lists, and I delete this one, I just get this blue box that's waiting there. And the reason for that is right now this is a UL that's just sitting here waiting for content to go in it. And you could use JavaScript where you could have like a div that's sitting here waiting, and then you're adding a new list, and then you have to do the logic of being like, is there an existing UL? No, so let's create the UL and then insert a list item in there, and then the next one you will insert will be like, oh, there already is one, so I'm only going to add it. And the logic for that ends up being a lot more complicated than just finding your existing UL and inserting list items in it. But because that task list has the background and padding on it, it's always visible, even if there's nothing in it. But I can just do a task list is empty, display none. And as long as it's empty, it disappears and there's nothing there. And as soon as I add stuff in there, well, now I have my lists coming in. I can delete those lists, and then it disappears. It gets a display none on it, so I don't have to worry about it. There are problems with this that you want to watch out for, though. One of them is people would just go, well, then I can just do this, empty. So anything that's empty gets a display none on it. But then images will disappear because they're replaced elements. The SVGs have disappeared because there's a lot of self-closing things that are in there, so they'll vanish. If you have HRs, those will get turned off as well. So they're not great. So you do not want to do blanket statement on this. It would just cause more trouble than it's worth. But you might have user-generated content that's coming in, like the UL that I had before. Here, maybe not the best example, but I have this span that's sitting here waiting for content, and you can see there's a box there waiting for it, which is my role. So if a user doesn't put it in, I don't really want a box with padding on it waiting there. So what I would suggest is just being very specific about, being very specific about the different things where you might want to actually be doing it. So I would say role is display empty to make sure that one thing isn't working. And if you had other things that are specific, you just focus on the ones where this could actually be a problem instead of doing it everywhere. The other problem with it is that right now, we have to go down, CodePen, right here is the role. If I put a space here, and let's just change the background here too. Background is, just to make sure you see it, background is red, and I'll throw an important on there. That should work. I don't see that coming on, background. I don't see it working, but I do see this is here. So I won't worry about the red then, but it's showing up on the screen right now. Maybe I could put a border on it. Border. Oh, that's because it's only if it's empty. That's why. Dot role background red important. That would work. I think. There we go. So you can see the role is there, even though I'm saying display none on empty and there's nothing here. And that's because if there's a single space, so empty spaces, they will count as content. The spec on empty has been updated, I think, a couple of years ago at this point, and no browser has yet to implement this yet. So you do need to make sure if you want empty to work, it has to be actually empty with no empty spaces or anything in it. And that's the same with all the browsers right now. Hopefully one day they fix that. So that just means when you're inserting content with JavaScript, insert the content that you need. Another thing, HTML only, lazy loading. Don't lazy load with like intersection observers. You don't have to. You can just throw loading equals lazy on there. It will work. The browser's smart. It's really good at what it does. It will be better because it knows the network connection speeds and everything else. You can do it on images and iframes. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff coming. All those other things I talked about are pretty well supported at this point. There's a lot of new things coming. I know I'm really short on time, so I'm only going to look at one of those, but add these to your list of stuff to look at if you haven't looked at all of them. Some of them do require a little bit of JavaScript. But this one I know people are going to get really excited about. So if you have a pop-up that opens and closes, this could be used for a tooltip and other things. All I'm doing right now is I have a button that has a popover target, as looking at that, and then I have a div with the ID matching it and a popover. And without any JavaScript, it will open and close it like magic. There's nothing else you have to do. But the really cool thing with this, and the popover is already really cool, definitely look into it. It could solve a lot of use cases you have for things. Potentially could be used for navigations. So something to think about there for a hamburger menu. By default, this has a light dismiss. So if I push escape or if I click anywhere else, it will close. There's ways that you can change that behavior, though, with a little bit of JavaScript. What I want to look at, though, really fast here, because I don't have a lot of time, is we can actually anchor things now, too. This is only in Chrome right now, but there's a good polyfill by Oddbird that you can use if you look it up. So here I can give an anchor name to my button, and then I can anchor my element to the position of that element. So I'm saying anchor name is this, position anchor is there, and then I can just say position area top. And if I do position area top, let's let the code pen, it will be at the top. Or I could switch this to bottom. And then when I open my menu, it will be at the bottom. And it's really cool. Let's just switch this for now over to a left. So it will be on the left side because I want it on the left for whatever reason. But then, of course, you might run out of room sometimes. The browser's small. That sucks. JavaScript library, talk about npm install. You don't need to do that. We have a position try at rule that we can do. And then we can do a position try fallbacks. And I can actually tell it where to go. And it will automatically move on its own and go to that spot. And you don't even need this, actually. We could do, I think it's flip. I won't be able to use the flip, but we have like flip inline or flip block, and there's other defaults you can do. And if the defaults don't work and you want specific things, you can create specific rules as well. And I'm even changing the margin there too.
I love how focused you are. Like, there's nothing that can interrupt you. We technically are in the Q&A part, and there were like
awesome. That was my last thing, so we're perfect. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, you did great. This was a fantastic talk. I learned so much about CSS that I wasn't even remotely aware of. So thank you very much for that.
I knew I was running short on time there, so I was like, let me get through this last one quick.
No,
sure. No, you did great. And I think we can go ahead. Yeah, cool. Kevin, I hate you. Because I'm sitting and listening to this, and it's like I'm getting a narrated version of CSS Zen Garden with this silky smooth voice, and I'm watching all these fabulous comments that you're getting, and I think I should really be better at this. I'm supposed to be a professional. We have a lot of comments. We'll try and go through them fast, but as to reference how great this was, the first comment I thought was just hilarious. You should get in the fried air business, maybe, you know? And Khalid has a good reminder for everybody about this, that if you like this, go over there and then subscribe. Let's go back to the top. Kevin, you only have 10 seconds to answer this one. How do you feel about Sass?
I love Sass. I still use it, which probably, I think that surprises people when they hear it.
It surprised me.
Yeah, I do like it. I use it less. I'm less reliant on it than I have to be, or we used to have to be. But I sort of had created a system that was pretty heavy into using maps and then looping through them to create custom properties and other stuff like that. So like so I use maps, I use mixins and loops a lot. So as long as I still use those, but then from that, it's mostly to then generate custom properties that I use still, because custom properties are great. Nesting is now part of CSS. So if it was a small project, I don't really have a need. But if it was something that I knew was going to scale quite a bit, I'd probably, for now at least, I'm still using Sass for.
We have a question in chat. I don't know if you can pop into the YouTube chat later. People are asking for a link to the code pen.
Yeah, I can actually. All the code pens are. Oh, you can't see it now. I will put it in. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
That's
here's a question for you. Did this dude really write all this in CSS?
I did.
Pretty fun. Just to give you a little shout out for everything that you're doing, I think this is pretty cool. You do have a great teaching style, and you know what? CSS is not what people remember it from anymore. And so it is a good time for us to all re-engage CSS. Plenty of content out there in Mastodon and stuff like that. Another good kudos for you. I'll go through this pretty quick. Colin pointed out this one, the tilde. So there are a number of aspects for CSS that maybe were in the spec for a long time and weren't implemented widely enough to trust and things.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of some stuff that just people, I think, just went under the radar. And then there's those other things that come along. Everyone wants to use them, or some people want to use them, but browser support's not there. And by the time browser support's good enough, everybody's forgot about them. So I think it's a combination sometimes of those. And there's a lot of weird, obscure things that are in there that you don't always need.
Okay, here's a legit question. This was answered a little bit by another person in chat, but I just want to see if you want to give your take on it. Can you style a calendar system pop-up?
Great answer.
Well,
perfect.
Right. I mean, calendars are a nightmare. Even like just a select is hard enough. They are working on a select menu element, which is exactly the same as your select, but will be 100% stylable. Do whatever you want with it. So they are working on, there's OpenUI, which is a group that's doing a lot of work in trying to make these things actually things that we can use more regularly, because even calendars are so hard too, because on like if you're on mobile, you probably just want to rely on the system ones because they're good and they work well. But then on desktop, it's a little trickier. But yeah, you sort of need a custom solution if you want to style it.
You just brought up something that made me think I should troll you by posting a question and bringing it up. Do you think web components will kill SPA frameworks? Just kidding. All of you out there, just kidding. A question about keyboard strokes in CSS, maybe holding back some of these examples.
Holding back a few of the, I don't think it's just not what CSS is meant for. I think it's where like JavaScript still does have a purpose. And so I think, right, and it's not that we want to just remove it. It's just like, let's use CSS for what it's good at, and that's involving what's being painted on the page. Whereas as soon as the user interaction comes into it, that's where I think JavaScript should come in.
Got it. All right. And then we'll make this the last question, and then I'll let Jan do a little bit of closeout if he has any follow-up that he wanted to ask. This is kind of one of those art versus science. Do you put it in the peanut butter or the chocolate?
As I said at the very beginning, I'm biased towards CSS solutions if they're viable, just because it's what I'm comfortable with. But also, if it just, if I don't need to get the browser, the things that you can do with only HTML and CSS, it's just the browser's aware of all of those things that are going on, and it's going to be super highly optimized to handle all of that. So if it's able to do that for me, and I don't have to write code to figure that out, then I would just use the HTML and CSS. There is definitely a crossover. Like even in the example I was showing where like the warning was coming up, for accessibility reasons, you can have like an area live region, but I think you need to use JavaScript to change the text in there for that actually to be alerted to the user. So it could be something where you have that div that's there that's only being shown, but then you could be using JavaScript to change the text that's in there potentially. But that could also be good because you could get more fine-grained, errors for the user and everything too.
And if you think that's advanced, go to the chat where Waldo shows how to do a keylogger in CSS. Kevin, we have 10 more fantastic questions, including accessibility, that came up while we were talking, but we're out of time. I think everyone should join us next year for Kevin Powell Day 2025, where WebStorm will just host you for the entire day. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everything that you do. And 2025 will be the year of CSS on the desktop. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.